I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Black Lives Matter protests are taking place all over the world. The brutal and inhumane killing of George Floyd has brought together millions of people of every ethnicity, age, and gender globally. Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, killing Floyd. He was first charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter, which has since been upgraded to second-degree murder. Hello, Aluxers. Today we march along with millions and bring you some of the biggest protests in the world. Come to get inspired. If you're not subscribed yet, you're missing out. Number 10. Tiananmen Square. The 4th of June 2020 marks the 31st anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, which took place across China, also referred to as the June 4th incident. If you lived in China, the stories that marked this indelible day in history are nowhere to be found. The stories do not appear in history books, information is censored and controlled, and organizers involved in the event have been arrested or exiled and their relatives closely monitored. So why did over 1 million people support this protest? Pro-democracy protesters, mainly students, wanted democracy, freedom of the press, and free speech. A hunger strike began on May 13th, which led to others following suit across China. The Chinese government did not feel at ease with the strikes, especially when it clashed with a visit from Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, who was meant to pass through Tiananmen Square. Despite the change of venue to the airport and no incident occurring, Chinese officials sent troops of 250,000 into the crowds gathering at Tiananmen Square. By the end of May, there were 1 million people in the square, and even though the troops were sent in, it did little to defuse the situation. Troops got heavy-handed quickly, and things spiraled out of control when they began firing into the crowds. Thousands of protesters were killed and up to 10,000 were arrested. The Tiananmen Square Massacre, as it's also known, is always remembered by those living in Hong Kong who hold a vigil on the anniversary every year. This year, 2020, despite a ban to mark the 31st anniversary, thousands of people dressed in black headed to Hong Kong's Victoria Park. Police resorted to using pepper spray to disperse crowds, leaving the situation chaotic and in shambles. Number 9. Hashtag Ricky Renuncia. Over 1.1 million people conglomerated in San Juan, Puerto Rico in July 2019, calling for Governor Ricardo Rossello's resignation. The crowds were there for more than a week and had 2 valid reasons for the protest. The first was a corruption probe concerning the government's handling of contracts valued at $15.5 million. Julia Kelleher, former education secretary, along with Angela Avila Morero, former chief of Puerto Rico's Health Insurance Administration, were accused of handing the contracts to businesses that they were personally connected to, regardless of whether they were qualified for the jobs or not. The second situation caused huge uproar when 900 pages of leaked telegram messages between Governor Ricardo Rossello and 11 of his top aides and cabinet ministers were leaked. The scandal was labeled the Telegram Gate scandal, Ricky Leaks, and Chatgate. In the telegram exchanges, the former governor and his cronies made disparaging comments about those affected by Hurricane Maria. The comments were sexist, homophobic, vulgar, and violent, even making fun of the dead. When the former governor defended himself, he added that although his acts were inappropriate, they were not illegal. However, eventually Rossello did step down. Number 8. The Orange Revolution. Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych may share the same first name, but that's where it ends. Both men were running for presidency in the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election, and when Yanukovych won the vote, there were bold claims the election was rigged and that many voters were intimidated to vote for Yanukovych. The people protested, and for 2 months and 1 day, from November 22, 2004 to January 23, 2005, crowds of over 1 million people gathered in the Ukraine. The original results were annulled and there was a revote. Yushchenko won the election, fair and square, with 52% of the votes, and the Orange Revolution came to an end when Yushchenko was inaugurated. Number 7. People's Vote March. Reports vary on the exact numbers of those attending the People's Vote March in London on March 23, 2019. Some reports suggest a mere 400,000 people. Others claim 1 million people, with some even suggesting as many as 2 million. But one thing is certain, the anti-Brexit protest was one of the largest in UK history. What riled so many people up? the UK's exit from the EU planned for January 2020. The March protests' aim was to have a second Brexit referendum. A second march took place, a Let Us Be Heard march, on the 19th of October 2019. Again, it suggested that as many as 1 million people participated. A petition sent to Parliament collected a record-breaking 6.1 million signatures, of those wanting to stay a part of the EU. In 2016, a vote was done to ascertain whether the UK should leave the EU, with 52% of the votes in favour of the split. In 2020, it's possible that COVID-19 might mean a no deal for Brexit. Number 6. March for Our Lives. This is officially one of the largest protests in American history. Shortened to MFOL, the protest took place in Washington, D.C. on the 24th of March, 2018. The turnout saw numbers between 1.2 and 2 million people, all with one common goal: to prevent gun violence in the U.S. An additional 880 events took place across America and the globe. All events were organized by the nonprofit Never Again MSD, a student political action committee that aims to reduce gun violence. There were many celebrities that got involved with the march. George and Amal Clooney donated $500,000 toward the cause, with Oprah matching the amount. The event was promoted by James Corden and other big names like Will Smith, Cher, Amy Poehler, and Justin Timberlake. Social media was a huge driving force behind the success of this protest, with hashtag March for Our Lives being used more than 3.6 million times. And coming up, another march that had influencers and celebrities in the dozens showing up for support. Number 5. Indian anti-corruption protests. Time magazine named this protest one of the top stories to emerge from 2011. Politics isn't always fair, and in the Indian government, corruption has been par for the course. The sluggish economic growth, the high unemployment figures, and poverty were all blamed on socialist-inspired economic policies. In April of 2011, anti-corruption activist Anna Hazare wanted a committee to be formed that would introduce tough anti-corruption legislation. The Prime Minister at the time, Manmohan Singh, rejected the idea, so Hazare went on a hunger strike. It wasn't long before 1.5 million people joined the fasting, and they set up camp outside of government buildings in support of the proposed legislation. Hazare fasted for 12 days, a total of 288 hours. He and his 1.5 million supporters were unsuccessful in getting any anti-corruption legislation put in place. Number 4. Women's March. The 2017 Women's March is officially the largest protest in a single day in the history of the U.S. Between 3.2 and 5.3 million took part in the protest that took place the day after President Donald Trump's inauguration. Many felt that Trump's statements were offensive and anti-women. The Women's March is not solely for the rights of women, but also LGBTQ, religious freedom, workers' rights, racial equality, better healthcare, environmental protection, and more. The march stresses that women's rights are human rights. It took place again in 2018, where around 1.5 million people participated. The march has taken place in 2019 and 2020, but with much lower numbers than previous years. The celebrity participation in the 2017 march was phenomenal, including the likes of Katy Perry, Scarlett Johansson, Rihanna, Chris Rock, and Kevin Bacon. And Alexers, we have loads of information about some of these noteworthy celebs, including this one on Katy Perry. 15 things you didn't know about Katy Perry. Number 3. The Occupy movement. October 17, 2011 was the first date that Occupy protests took place. The Occupy Wall Street movement initially had a mere 1,000 protesters gathered in New York City's Zuccotti Park. From that small start, the movement had upwards of 5 million people across 82 countries, 951 cities, and 600 communities coming together to show dissatisfaction with social and economic equality. The protest was dubbed the Global Justice Movement by Manfred Steger. The movement was partially ignited by an Adbusters campaign group based in Canada. It's from the Occupy movement that the well-known slogan, "We are the 99%, comes from. This slogan referred to most of the wealth being distributed amongst the top 1% of income earners. In the protest's early days, the campaign was criticized for not having a clear objective. There were no real demands from those marching, making it easy for the protesters to grow without borders. This was disrupted by many when it finally emerged that the goals were clear. Tighter banking industry regulations, prohibit high-frequency trading, end corruption in politics, and hold those responsible for the 2008 financial crash liable for their actions. The movement was leaderless, but with everyone joining together, their unified voice was heard. Number 2. May 1968, France protests. France's economy ground to a halt in 1968. Civil unrest went on for roughly 7 weeks, along with demonstrations, strikes, and the occupation of factories and universities. Things got so bad that politicians were preparing for a revolution or a civil war. Neither came, but what did happen was that 11 million workers went on strike. This was 22% of the entire population. It began with a small group of students protesting consumerism, capitalism, and American imperialism. Reports suggest that male students were also angry about not being able to visit the girls' dormitories. The police did not take kindly to the protesting, and France's trade union confederations retaliated by calling others to sympathy strike. Their calls were heard, and 11 million people participated in the strike, making it the largest general strike ever attempted in France. When influencers heard about the police brutality, they arranged a one-day general strike which saw 1 million people march through Paris. The event is still remembered today as the time when conservative views were challenged and people started having broader outlooks on sexuality, human rights, religion, and freedom. Number 1. Iraq War protest. The largest protest in the world took place on the 15th of February 2003. Between 6 and 11 million people in 650 cities around the world protested against the U.S.'s agenda to invade Iraq. French academic Dominique Renier suggests as many as 36 million people took part in this protest. It's the largest anti-war movement in history and is the largest one-day global protest that has ever taken place. For example, Rome alone had 3 million people taking part. A poll was done across 41 countries with less than 10% of the participants in support of war. However, despite the millions of people against the invasion of Iraq, it still went ahead. Iraq was invaded by the U.S. on the 20th of March, 2003. Alexers, have you ever taken part in a protest? What is your feeling about people coming together to protest for a common goal? Let us know in the comments. And for sticking with us until the end, here's your bonus. The largest online protest in history occurred in January of 2012. The web blacked out. Sites like Wiki, Wired, and 100,000 others shut themselves off on the 18th of January. This was in response to 2 bills that Congress wanted to impose: SOPA, Stop Online Piracy Act, and PIPA, the Protect IP Act. The aim of the new bills was to tackle online privacy, and anyone caught streaming copyrighted material could be imprisoned for up to 5 years. Companies like Facebook, Google, eBay, and Twitter were against the proposed laws, and they were never passed. Thank you for spending some time with us. Make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another video.